Good afternoon to everyone who is joining on. I would suggest waiting another minute before we start to give some more people the chance to join in. All right then. A warm welcome to everyone who is listening today. My name is Sophie, and as the manager of the European Sustainable Food Coalition, I'm very excited to moderate today's webinar with the title SBTi and ESFC, from target setting to measurable progress. Before we begin, I would like to mention a small technical detail. In case the slides seem to be cut off on your screen, please make sure to press the 3 dots on the bottom of your screen to find the option to enter full screen mode. And now I would like to introduce today's agenda. First, I will give you a brief introduction about the European Sustainable Food Coalition, share why it is more important than ever to collaboratively make progress, and line out the synergies between SBTi and the ESFC in driving credible, measurable climate action across the food value chain. Afterwards, we will have the pleasure to gain insights from Kim Shopkin, the Europe Regional Lead at the Science Based Target Initiative, and she will share more about SBTi's mission with focus on the food and beverage sector. After that, we will dive into the panel discussion, where we are very pleased to have Michael Löscher, Climate Strategy Lead at Schwarz Group, an international leader in the retail industry, as well as Markus Linder, co-founder and CEO of inoqo and co-initiator of the European Sustainable Food Coalition, joining Kim Shopkin to discuss the synergies between SBTi and ESFC in the food sector, the role of product-level data in achieving credible targets, and to give the retail perspective, early challenges and lessons from SBTi implementation. Additionally, I'd like to mention that you're very welcome to use the Q&A chat to place your questions at any time during the event. We will do our best to address as many of them as possible at the end of the panel discussion. And all of that being said, I'm excited to start off and give you some insights into our work at the European Sustainable Food Coalition and how this aligns with the SBTi initiative. So the motivation of our work is very clear. Our food system has an immense impact on planet and people. It is contributing to 70% of biodiversity loss on land, having drastic socioeconomic impacts given the high number of employees in this sector, and it contributes to over a third of greenhouse gas emissions. To lower these impacts, it is essential to look into the data. And here it is quite clear that for retailers, restaurants, caterers, brands, and producers, the majority of the impact stems from scope 3, so from the up and downstream value chain activities. When looking at the details of these scope 3 emissions, we can see that 2/3 are stemming from the land-based sector. Meaning, to understand and lower the impact, it is essential to really look at what is happening at the farm. However, when trying to assess the scope 3 impact of those food and beverage players, we face several challenges. There are many different solution providers doing product impact assessments at scale. However, if several of these solution providers assess the same product, the result will most likely be quite different. You think there is a clear guidance on how to calculate the impact. Unfortunately, there is not. There are several different guidances like EU Product Environmental Footprint, PEF, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, or ISO, which leads to inconsistencies in calculations. And even if two solution providers follow the same standard, there's still too much room for interpretation, leading to a lack of comparability in results. Apart from the standards and use methodologies, the discrepancies are also caused by the use of different databases. And this fragmentation is making it very difficult or even impossible to make informed decisions as a consumer and also as a product manager trying to lower the impact. Another topic is also that assessments of food and beverage products are often done with category averages. And this might be sufficient for reporting purposes and fulfilling reporting requirements like the CSRD. However, if you want to improve and take measures to lower the impact, category averages are inadequate. And I can explain why based on a very simple example. So if you have 3 different pasta sauces, one containing meat, one being vegetarian with cheese inside, and another one being fully vegan, it is quite clear that they have a very different impact. But they all have only one category average data set, which is tomato sauce. Meaning if you use this average data set to assess your products, you have the same value for all 3 sauces, even though it is very clear that they do not reflect the real impact. And this also means that optimization measures like lowering the meat proportion in the tomato sauce would not be visible in the numbers. So to actually demonstrate progress in the journey towards net zero, it is essential to move from category average values to ingredient-specific data. But unfortunately, even if moving to granular primary data assessed at the farm, we face very similar challenges. Data is inconsistent, methodologies differ, and clear guidance is missing, so that overall results are not comparable, which would be crucial, obviously, to make progress towards sustainability goals. And a study from the UK Environmental Ministry showed that the difference of results, if calculated with different tools, can reach up to 350% for the same agricultural product. So there's a really big gap. And all these challenges, that's exactly why the European Sustainable Food Coalition was initiated, to facilitate a pre-competitive space, bringing together all actors in the food and beverage space to align on a standardized framework for food and beverage impact assessment on the product as well as the farm level. For the beginning, we are focusing on climate. However, in the long run, we also want to address other dimensions like animal welfare, socioeconomic impacts, biodiversity, and more. And the second key pillar of our work is to shape the regulatory direction and provide with our work a solid foundation for regulatory initiatives like the Green Claims Directive or a potential European Sustainable Food Labeling Framework. You can see on this slide also a sneak peek of our members, but please note that this is not a comprehensive list. We are waiting to reveal all of our founding members until after our formal incorporation as NGO in Brussels. And for this, we are currently waiting for the feedback from the Ministry of Justice, which is taking some time. All right, then let's get a bit more concrete and look at the objectives that we aim to achieve with this pre-competitive collaboration. So the long-term goal, which will require a lot of effort and time, is to have a standardized food and beverage impact assessment framework in place. We already started with the first working groups and are making progress on this important task. Here it is relevant to mention that we do not plan to reinvent the wheel. We are really trying to base our work on existing standards and guidances like the Product Environmental Footprint, PEF, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Product Standard, and PACT. We merely want to align on how to use the existing standards and discuss how to deal with topics that are not sufficiently clarified in these standards yet. And then we see grocery retailers and food service providers as a very important player and as a very important role, simply because they have the power to influence the entire value chain from consumers to suppliers up until the farm. Given that these players have thousands of products on the shelves or many different meals on their menus, it is impossible to have primary data for all of it in place from the start, and it is definitely not the solution to wait until all the primary data is there. Therefore, it is crucial to enable them to do scalable impact assessments, not only based on category averages, as they are far away from reality, as I explained before with the tomato sauces, but by taking publicly available data like the ingredient lists into account. Nonetheless, it is one of our foundational principles to incentivize the shift towards more primary data. And we have a dedicated working group aligning exactly on this topic. Their work showed that it is essential to ensure that the results based on secondary data have in most cases a higher impact than the actual primary data, because if results currently communicated to suppliers and consumers have a lower impact than the primary data, the farmers and producers would never be willing to share their data, as it would make their product seem less favorable than before. We envision to achieve this by adding a margin of safety to the results based on average secondary data to ensure that when sharing primary data, the impact of the results goes, at least in most cases, down instead of up, meaning the farmers and producers have a clear incentive to share their data. And it is important to note here that we only envision this for consumer and supplier communication and not for reporting purposes. Additionally, the working group also outlined that it is crucial to give more detailed information, for example, via a QR code, showing the result has actually a bandwidth and not just a margin of safety, and could be either higher or lower than the averages used for the calculation. As I mentioned also before, it is very important for our initiative to align with and contribute to the regulatory landscape to ensure compliance, but also to proactively influence ongoing developments to ensure upcoming regulations are practical and actually help the transition towards greater sustainability instead of being purely seen as democratic burden. We have here contacts to the European Commission and received also very positive feedback from the start that it is in their best interest to have organizations' inputs in the development of new regulations. And here the European Sustainable Food Coalition is a great tool to streamline these inputs. Another important point is that we aim to cooperate with the entire value chain. To include real-world life challenges of all the different players of the food system. Apart from that, we are also getting into exchange with other initiatives pursuing similar goals, simply to avoid duplication of efforts. So we are more than happy to take on any work that is already done and wherever possible and aligned with our principles, incorporate this work into our frameworks. And last but definitely not least, we want to enhance farmer rewards for sustainable practices and communicate these improvements throughout the entire value chain until the consumers. On the following slide, I would like to point out the urgency of our mission and why it is more important than ever to get together and tackle this huge challenge now. As mentioned, methodologies to assess the impact of food and beverage products are currently very fragmented, and therefore sustainability data is not sufficient to make progress towards sustainability goals in the food and beverage sector. The CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, should have given the missing regulatory pressure to ensure that accurate data becomes public. However, with the Omnibus, it is currently under discussion to weaken these regulatory requirements by exempting small and medium-sized enterprises and companies under 1,000 employees and delaying due diligence obligations. I saw now that there might be issues too with the audio. I will try to speak louder and put my microphone closer. I hope it works then better. I'm very sorry. It would be great if you could let me know in the chat if it works better now. Okay. Great. So then let's continue. So the Omnibus could exempt many companies from those reporting requirements, and this would mean retailers and food service providers would risk losing visibility on Scope 3 emissions and broader environmental and social impacts, because with the changes, many of their suppliers would not be obliged to report this crucial data anymore. Therefore, to move from generic data, which is insufficient to demonstrate progress, voluntary collaboration is more essential than ever to ensure that the required data is being collected and shared, ultimately to reduce impacts and work towards achieving sustainability goals, which is much more feasible with collaborative efforts. Okay, I got the feedback that audio seems to be fine now. Thank you very much. And now on my last slide, I would like to draw the context of our work to what is being done by SBTi. I would like to highlight the synergies in driving credible, measurable climate action across the food value chains. So it is clear ambition is the foundation, and that's where SBTi plays a very essential role. By defining what science-aligned climate targets look like, SBTi has created a globally recognized framework that sets a clear direction for companies to align with the 1.5 degrees pathway. But Kim will share more about that during her presentation later on. However, to actually reach those targets, ambition alone is not enough. Companies also need credible, comparable data and a way to quantify the impact of their optimization measures. Without this, progress can't be measured, and what can't be measured can't be improved. That's where ESFC comes in. With our work to standardize impact assessments based on the guidances that already exist, we build an important foundation to enable food and beverage companies to reach SBTi targets. SBTi requires credible and ideally primary data. Here our work is also clearly aligned, as one of our foundational principles is to incentivize the transition to primary data. Our vision is clear: to help companies move from generic averages to increasingly detailed supplier-specific data over time. In parallel to the approach that I explained before, where we envision to add a margin of safety on average values to incentivize primary data sharing, we are also working on a midterm solution to make impact data more credible. We want to enable key farm level input data, like for example, the average fertilizer used or the electricity mix, to be passed down through the supply chain. To consider confidentiality, we came here up with a dual code system. So very briefly explained, one code being shared via the receipts and one code being shared from us to impact assessors, which have to sign a strict NDA. And only if combining both codes, the data that is stored at the farm level impact assessment assessor chosen by the farmer can be accessed. This data will be essential then for scalable product level impact assessments, helping consumers and product managers to make informed choices. This was just a very brief outline. If you're keen to receiving more information about this approach and getting involved, then I would be happy to connect. I will share later the contact details. And implementation in the food sector is uniquely challenging. Supply chains are fragmented and primary data is hard to access at the farm level. The European Sustainable Food Coalition was created specifically to address these complexities. And this is exactly what SBTi encourages: sector-specific pathways. Lastly, SBTi pushes companies to influence upstream and downstream partners, which our work is very much aligned with. On the one side, we at the ESFC create space for collaboration between value chain partners. And on the other side, we want to equip retailers and food service providers, which are uniquely positioned to influence both upstream suppliers and farmers and downstream consumers, with the tools to incentivize primary data sharing of their value chain. So overall, there are clear synergies between the work we are doing at the European Sustainable Food Coalition and the work that is being done at the Science Based Target Initiative. Accurate and comparable data, which we want to make accessible by providing a standardized methodological framework, are the key to move from target setting to measurable progress. So in case you're interested in learning more about our work or getting involved, please feel free to reach out at the contact information. I think we will share it also in the Q&A chat, and you can also see it on the slide here. On that note, I would also like to remind you to make use of the Q&A chat for your question. You can add them anytime during the following presentation and the panel discussion. And before handing now over to Kim, I'd like to turn to you, our audience, for a quick poll. If you're working in an organization where the Science-Based Target Initiative is relevant, we'd love to know if your organization is committed to an SBTi target. You should now see response options on your screen. either yes, our target is approved, or yes, we've submitted and are awaiting approval. No, not yet, but we are in internal discussions, or no, we are currently have no plans to adopt an SBTi target. All right. Thank you very much for voting. That's very encouraging to hear that more than 50% said yes, the target has already been approved even. Yeah, I'm still sure that the next presentation will offer you valuable insights related to the work that the organization is already doing in this context. So with that, I'm very delighted to welcome Kim Shopkin, Europe Regional Lead at SBTi, to the stage. Kim will guide us through the work of SBTi and how it specifically applies to companies in the food and beverage sector. Welcome on stage, Kim.
Thanks, Sophie. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar today about science-based targets. I'm happy to present about it. I will first talk a little bit about SBTi and introduce you to science-based targets, which for at least 50% of you is not really necessary anymore, but I hope it will be useful for the other 50% of you, and maybe a reminder or a refresher for the ones that already have targets. At the end, I will briefly still introduce an update on our draft corporate net zero standard, which was published in March and is still open for a few days for consultation. So that might be of interest for all of you as well. Then, are you seeing my screen? Yes, right?
Yes.
So yes. And it's now
you first slide.
Okay. I don't. And now you see the next slide?
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
All
okay.
Works well.
Great. Okay, so who are we? The Science Based Targets Initiative is a global body enabling businesses and financial institutions to set ambitious emission reduction targets in line with the latest climate science. SBTi was founded on actually a very simple idea, which was that businesses should be able to set emission reduction targets that are based on climate science and be consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So as you all know, the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015, and that's also when SBTi was brought into being. So now, 10 years later, we develop standards, tools, and guidances that allow companies to set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in line with what is needed to keep global heating below catastrophic levels and reach net zero by 2050 at the latest. We are incorporated, we are a global organization, but incorporated as a UK charity with a subsidiary called SBTi Services, which host our target validation service. And we work with several partner organizations who facilitated SBTi's growth and also development. And the main ones are CDP, United Nations Global Compact, World Resources Institute, WWF, and the We Mean Business Coalition. And since 2015, we came a long way. There are now more than 10,000 businesses globally that have already validated science-based targets or have committed to set science-based targets. So of those, almost 8,000 have already validated science-based targets. And of those 8,000, 1,700 have, in addition to near-term targets, also validated net zero targets. And when we're looking at specifically the food sector, there's globally 627 companies with validated targets and an additional 335 who have committed to set targets within 24 months. And of the 627, there are 237 who have, in addition to validated near-term targets, also flag targets. For the ones of you who don't know what a flag target is, I will explain it a few slides down the road. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why it's so important that even more businesses than now set emission reduction targets that are in line with what science says is needed to keep global warming limited to 1.5 degrees. Because we are facing an enormous emission gap, and you can see that on this slide. So the blue area shows the policies and actions governments currently put in place to reduce emissions. And the green line shows the emission reductions needed to keep global warming limited to 1.5 degrees. So as you can see in the red, as the red arrow shows, there remains really a substantial gap between what governments are doing and what they would need to be doing to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And this is the emissions gap that the private sector can and should help address. And this is not only important because the climate impacts will have humanitarian consequences. It's also because it would be an economic disaster. So climate change could cut global economic output by 11 to 14%, or up to 23 trillion, so roughly the size of the entire US economy. And rising global temperatures will continue disrupting supply chains, driving losses between 4 to 25 trillion by 2060, as extreme weather events will hit agriculture, labor, and logistics. So also for our economy, it's really important that all businesses now act and we bring emissions down as quick as possible. And now I will go into what that then means. So what do businesses need to do to set a science-based target, and what is a science-based target actually? That's explained on this slide. Simply put, a science-based target shows companies how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change. At SBTi, companies can set two types of science-based targets. First of all, a near-term target. That's the target that every company coming to SBTi needs to set. It's a target for 5 to 10 years. A company can choose in between that period, and it ensures that the company is taking near-term action to reduce emissions at a pace that is consistent with keeping warming below 1.5 degrees. And so, as you can see in the graph, you set a near-term target. When your target year is reached, you will set another near-term target until you reach 2050. However, in addition, we advise and recommend companies to set also a long-term or net zero target. And although it seems a long time away, and you say, well, we're already taking near-term action and have our near-term target, why is it then important to set a net zero target? Well, it is important because it provides a strategic direction for your company and serves as a North Star. It will prevent you from making investment decisions that might lock you into emitting greenhouse gas emissions for coming decades, and makes it then impossible for you to reach net zero by 2050. And here, there's 4 key elements explained, of which the net zero targets consists. The first one is the near-term target. The second one is the long-term target. I can add to that for most companies, it means a long-term target means reducing emissions by 90% by 2050. And then there's 10% of residual emissions left. And for that, we have the third element to which you need to commit when you set a net zero target. And that is neutralization of these 10% of residual emissions, or less than 10%. That's also possible and recommended even. So neutralization means that you commit to investing in the permanent removals of your residual emissions from the atmosphere. So removing the emission from the atmosphere and ensuring that they are stored permanently. And then the last element of a net zero target is not mandatory, but it's recommended, and that's beyond value chain mitigation. So in the transition to net zero, companies should take action to mitigate emissions beyond their value chain. So that's in addition to reducing or to reaching their targets. And this can be done, for example, by purchasing high quality RED Plus credits or investing in direct air capture and geological storage. And beyond value chain, by investing in beyond value chain mitigation, you address your ongoing emissions. So the emissions that you are still emitting while on the journey to reaching your net zero targets. So the net zero and the near-term targets are cross-sector standards that all companies in all sectors can use. In addition, we also develop specific sector guidances. And we developed those for 12 high emitting sectors. And you see an overview here. Some are still being developed, like chemicals, which is almost finished, while others are being updated, like land transport, we have a guidance already, but it's also being updated. And some are fully usable, and that's an important one for the audience today is our FLAG guidance, so forest, land, and agriculture guidance. And what is important to know about these sector-based approaches is that we base them on global scenarios, and the inputs include sectoral carbon budgets, and they also take into consideration emissions projections for the specific sectors along with activity projections, so how much demand is expected to grow, the innovation potential, and also other market consideration. Then I'll dive a little bit deeper in the FLAG guidance, so the forest, land, and agriculture guidance, because it will be relevant for most of the companies listening today. So the FLAG target is a separate target for a company's emissions from land use. For all other emissions, a target needs to be set using the cross-sector standard. So that is different from most of the other sector guidances for which companies use for all their targets. When you as a company use the FLAG targets, you use it or the FLAG guidance, you use it for your land use emissions, while for all your other emissions, you use the cross-sector standards. And companies in the following sectors are required to set a FLAG targets: forest and paper products, food production, food and beverage processing, food and staples retailing, and tobacco. In addition, companies in other sectors with FLAG-related emissions that total more than 20% of their overall emissions across all scopes are also required to set the FLAG targets. Good to know is that companies that are eligible for the SME route do not need to set a FLAG target. And I will get to the definition of SME and the SME route in a few slides still. Also good to know is that when your company already had a science-based target before the FLAG guidance was published, it is required to set a FLAG target when you are renewing your target after 5 years. Every company needs to renew their target at SBTi after 5 years. When it's time for your renewal, you will need to set a FLAG target in addition to your cross-sector target. Or 6 months after the publication of the final version of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol land sector and removal guidance. Then, how do you set a science-based target as a company? We have two different routes. One is for large companies and financial institutions, and one is for small and medium-sized enterprises, which I'll explain. The difference I'll explain in a few slides. But first, this is the process for developing your target, which is the same for both larger companies and SMEs. You need to start with calculating your greenhouse gas inventory. And for that, you need to use the standards of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. When your inventory is ready, you can determine a base year emission. And having that, you can select a target year. And after selecting your target year, you can model your targets using tools on the SBTi website. And this is the route that you would need to take. You start with SBTi with registering. we have a validation portal where you register your company. You need to submit some information about your company. Your registration will be checked and then will be approved. This is a new step since October last year. So in case your company had contact, a commitment or validation with SBTi before that date, you will still need to do this registration when you come back to SBTi. Then when you are registered, you can choose to commit, to make a commitment to set a target. You can do that in the portal. And that means that you commit to setting a science-based targets within 24 months. And then within that period, you can develop your target. And you can, for that, you need to use this, go through the steps that I explained in the previous slides. And when you develop your target and it's ready, you can submit it in the portal. After you submitted your targets, it will take about 2 months before you get a validation date assigned, and after, or that's the current waiting time, can become a little bit shorter still. And after that, it will take 30 days for a near-term target and 60 days for a net zero target to get validated. When your target is approved and validated, you will be required to announce it within 6 months and inform all your stakeholders. And it will also be published on our website in our target dashboard, where all companies with validated targets or commitments can be found. And you'll be required to annually disclose your progress. You don't need to report it currently to the SBTi, but it needs to be publicly reported. Then how does this process is different for SMEs? Well, the process for SMEs is a bit more streamlined. They do set or can set near-term and net zero targets, but they cannot make a commitment first, so they need to immediately submit their targets. And when setting near-term targets, SMEs are not required to set Scope 3 targets. They do need to commit to measuring their Scope 3 and making an inventory, and also making an effort to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, but they don't need to set an actual target. And here's the definition for SME. There's quite some requirements. You can find it on our website. I won't go into details now, but I always advise companies to register. If you really want to be sure if your company is eligible for the SME route, the best is to register on our website, because then you will get the confirmation from our validation team. And registration is free and doesn't oblige you to anything. Then lastly, I would like to stress that although it's really important, of course, to set science-based targets to stop the catastrophic consequences of climate change, it also has benefits for your business. As you saw, we have thousands of companies that have already set science-based targets and are very busy implementing them. And many of them reported that actually they found there's many benefits to having targets in place and implementing them. I'll go through them quickly here. So the first one is increased internal alignment on decarbonization goals. When you have a target, it's approved by management. There's less discussion. Everybody knows the direction and why it's important that certain decarbonization activities and decisions need to be taken. Then the low carbon transition can drive innovation, because your company might need to develop new products or services. It also can increase competitiveness, reducing energy and resource related costs. It can increase resilience for regulatory policy and market developments. Well, although in the EU, of course, the last year we've seen a little bit of a weakening of the legislation overall globally. The trend is that more and more climate regulation and requirements are coming into place. With science-based targets and transition plans, you are ready for all climate regulation to come. And then lastly, an important reason for many of the companies coming to us to set targets is that they are required to do so by their investors or by their customers. If you have science-based targets in place, you can show your investors and your customers that you're ready and are working on transitioning. Then, lastly, I want to briefly update you on the revision of our corporate net zero standard. So, in 2021, we launched our current corporate net zero standard. It contains guidance, criteria, and recommendations to support companies in setting net zero targets. And it also controls some criteria for near-term targets. And to date, more than 1,700 companies have used the standard to set targets. So, and now, 4 years later, the corporate net zero standard is undergoing its first major revision. This is in line with the SBTi standard operating procedure for the development of SBTi standards. It says that every standard needs to be updated every 2 to 5 years. And that's because we want to ensure that they continue to align with the latest climate science and also with best practice. But also we want to incorporate feedback we've received from all those companies implementing the standard. And some of the proposed changes in the standard really aim to address the key challenges companies experienced in implementing and achieving net zero targets. And I would like to. So there's many changes in the standard, and you can find those in the draft standard itself, and also they are explained there. But we also have additional explanatory materials that are a bit quicker to go through. But I want to explain one here today, or a few that are related to Scope 3, as it's very relevant for our panel discussions on data. Because we know, and that's from all the feedback we received from companies that have set science-based targets, that for basically all businesses of all sizes in all places, all regions of the world, Scope 3 is the biggest barrier to setting net zero targets. And to provide solutions for those barriers, we've introduced 3 major updates on Scope 3. And they aim to make Scope 3 target setting more effective in driving net zero transformation, while also recognizing the operational challenges faced by companies. And the first update is a proposal to update the target boundary. So maybe to be clear in advance. So this is all these changes are all still proposals. And can be changed still when we publish until we publish the final version. And it's also very depending on the feedback we're getting during this consultation round and the second consultation round, which will be later this year. So the first proposed change on Scope 3 is an updated target boundary. In the current version of the standards, the target boundary is defined by a 67% blanket threshold approach. That's for near term and 90% for long term. The revised standard explicitly incentivizes companies to prioritize action on the most relevant sources of emissions in their value chain. And it does this by requiring companies to prioritize Scope 3 targets on the most emission-intensive activities within their value chain and those where they have the greatest influence. Then secondly, we've also expanded the toolkit to address these emissions by introducing further optionality in target setting methods. And this includes introducing a new alignment target setting method that emphasizes outcome-based measurement rather than just absolute or intensity-based metrics. So this outcome-based metrics will make companies less reliant on data. So we partly hope to solve also the data problem with this. So then, to give you a picture of what these outcome-based metrics are, the current standards already use an outcome-based metrics in Scope 2, and that is the percentage of renewable energy sourced. So for Scope 2, you could already, instead of an emission reduction target, you could say, I'm going to source 100% of renewable energy. For Scope 3, we also had already the possibility for one outcome-based metrics target, and that is the supplier engagement target. So instead of an absolute emission reduction target, you could say, I'm going to get 67% of my suppliers to set science-based targets within 5 years, for which many companies chose that option. So the draft standard now proposes to broaden the use of outcome-based metrics and also alignment metrics to strengthen the impact and applicability of Scope 3 targets. And examples of new options are, for example, net zero transport mode used in logistics, or the percentage of net zero aligned materials you're sourcing, like aluminium or steel or cement. So you can, or you can set a target or the percentage of revenue that is coming from those net zero products, or the percentage of spend that you paid for net zero aligned activities or materials. If you're interested and would like to learn more, as I mentioned, it's explained in more detail in the standard itself. And finally, a third important change to Scope 3 is that we've introduced the concept of indirect mitigation. And this provides more flexibility in delivery, which I think will be also very important for the food sector. It recognizes the challenges that companies face in addressing value chain emissions, whether it's limited traceability or the limited ability to influence suppliers and customers. Good to know is that indirect mitigation has now been proposed as an interim measure, and we are exploring this in much more detail through the public consultation, and also working with expert working groups who are discussing this topic, and we're also going to pilot test this concept with companies. And that also summarizes my last slide on the next steps for the corporate net zero standard. If you want to know more about it, as I mentioned, you can find it on our website. There's a few days left to respond to our public consultation survey. So until the 1st of June, you can provide input, but we'll have another consultation later in the year. Before that, we'll first publish the second draft. And then also later in the year, there will be pilot testing. So if you're interested to pilot test the draft standard, you're welcome to apply. Soon there will be a form for that on our website soon. And yeah, we really hope to get your inputs and feedback on the proposed requirements and changes, because we want a standard that is in line with science, but it is also driving real impact. In decarbonization, and US companies know the best how we can make it as implementable as possible. Thank you. That was it for me.
Many thanks, Kim, for this great presentation. I'm sure there was lots of interesting content for our audience. Before we are moving on, I would like to remind our audience to make use of the Q&A chat. It's a great possibility to ask any questions you might have. And yes, now I would like to ask our two guests, Michael Löscher, Climate Strategy Lead at Schwarz Group, as well as Markus Linder, co-founder and CEO of inoqo and co-initiator of the European Sustainable Food Coalition, to join us on stage. I have prepared some questions for the three of you, and I'm very excited to start the discussion. So maybe... Perfect. Then let's start with you, Michael, because I know that Schwarz Group, an international leader in the retail industry, has recently committed to an SBTi target. So I would be interested in knowing what it is that motivated your organization to commit to this target and what the internal decision-making process was like.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for having me, and thanks also Sophie and Kim for the two very insightful presentations that you brought with you. I think there were a lot of information in there that helps all of us to proceed further. First of all, I would like to stress the fact that Sophie, we have a pretty clear understanding of the importance of the relevance of climate protection and climate adaptation for our businesses. We are selling food products, so majority of our revenue is still coming from food retail, and this is why we are depending on functioning ecosystems. We need soil on which crops can grow. We need trees and on which fruits can grow. So functional ecosystems are vital for our offering, are vital for our core business models. And whereas maybe a couple of decades ago, sustainability and also target setting was rather something you did for reputational reasons, maybe also because regulation was kicking in, and you were trying to be always a little bit ahead of us. I think climate protection and setting climate targets, and Kim pointed that out quite clearly, is rather a strategic risk management measure that we are taking than any of the other before mentioned. So Kim had some of the motivations that are certainly also true for us on one of her slides. But I think this is really the most important if we are not, changing how we are making business today, how we are producing today, and we are, getting this done in quite some time. Then in a couple of decades, we are not going to survive as a company anymore with the business models that we know. So you asked me, Sophie, what the decision-making process was like, and everything I think starts with, you first need to understand where you are at, what is the status quo, and that requires putting together a company carbon footprint, right? And if you're taking a look at the different logos above my shoulder, you may understand that there is quite some complexity with respect to business models that we have, the international environment in which we are operating. So we have quite diverse supply chains. So understanding this status quo, putting together this company carbon footprint was quite a task. We have this since 2018, and also since 2020, we are a member of the SBTi. Since 2021, we had the first near-term targets in Scope 1 and Scope 2. But last year, as you mentioned, we have revalidated, updated our targets, and also added Scope 3 targets to that. So the first questions that we asked ourselves was, how high can we set the bar for ourselves, right? What are the ambition levels that we can actually reach? What are possible pathways to realize the reduction, and what is realistic to reduce in near term and also in long term, in light of the projected growth of our companies, in light of the dynamic developments that we see in the markets, also technological development that we may take into account, partly uncertain or also changing regulatory frameworks under which we are working. All this makes it quite easy to set targets which are that far in the future. But nevertheless, we took that task, and we did that by running feasibility studies, scenario-based feasibility studies for each of the companies of the Schwarz Group, in order to understand what are the possible contributions of each of the companies to a group level goal. And the business models that we have are ranging from food production to food retail, to digital services, waste management services. So there were quite some different challenges that we had there, and different questions that we need to ask ourselves. Based on these scenario based feasibility studies, we then took decisions on near-term and net zero targets on group level, and strongly involved in all what we did there. Top management. It was something that was requested by top management, and we kept them involved as we go. And then finally, once we had the targets put together, the quite simple task was then just preparing the information material for the SBTi for the validation process. And of course, I'm kidding a little bit. That is not that easy. It requires actually a lot of understanding, a lot of knowledge, and also quite some effort to put this together and to run through the validation process. But Kim just mentioned that the SBTi also updated processes here, and I can, as a company or group of companies that just ran through that validation process since the end of March, we have newly validated near-term targets. You can also see them on the SBTi dashboard. I can tell you that the process really ran very smooth with the SBTi validation services that they put in place. It was highly professional, speedy responsiveness, and yeah, we finally successfully completed that goal. So we do have now validated near-term targets. We have, with the near-term targets last year, submitted also net zero commitment. So in the next weeks, we are going to submit also net zero targets for validation. And we are quite committed and are happy to see that the SBTi is developing not only with respect to the standard, Kim mentioned that, but also with respect to processes and also support and communication with and to the companies.
Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing these interesting insights about your internal processes, and congrats to the validated targets. That's great to hear. It's also really encouraging to hear that companies like yours are aware of the urgency, and it's simply in particular relevant for retailers and food service providers to commit to SBTi targets, to have a clear ambition to reduce the impact, as your actions have the power to influence the entire value chain. So thank you for that. Moving on with a question for Kim. SBTi requires credible data for flag targets. And given that more than 90% of emissions for retailers, food service providers, and brands in the food and beverage space stem from Scope 3, what are the biggest data gaps and action gaps right now?
Yes, thanks, Sophie. That's a very important question. I want to respond to that by saying that data isn't the finish line. So it's the starting block for us for real emissions reductions. And that is what it's all about, that companies are reducing emissions. In the food and beverage sector, Scope 3 emissions are really important, especially from agriculture and land use. But companies do really lack often reliable primary supplier level data. And that makes it very often impossible or nearly impossible to set meaningful targets or to really make impactful reductions. The good thing is that there is momentum. There's many solutions being developed by initiatives like the European Sustainable Food Coalition. So that's hopeful. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we are also at SBTi looking at this problem and trying to develop and propose solution and more flexible pathway that recognize credible action even when perfect data isn't available, such as targeting high impact supplier engagement or switching to verified lower carbon commodities. And to close the gap, companies should prioritize building supplier engagement programs. I advise that really incentivize data disclosure and sustainable practices. And my advice would also really be to don't wait for the perfect data, but start with what you have and improve it step by step and take action where you can as a company.
Thank you, Kim. Totally agree with what you're saying. It's time to move now and not to wait any longer. Yeah, very interesting. Now to Marcus. Given that you're the co-initiator of the European Sustainable Food Coalition, where do you see the greatest potential for alignment between SBTi and the ESFC efforts in the food system?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophie, for the great presentation and for this great question. So I obviously see a lot of potential for alignment and synergy between SBTi and the work that we are doing here for the food system, because both organizations are really highly complementary. As we've heard earlier, SBTi is about really providing the underlying framework for setting ambitious science-based targets and for thoroughly monitoring progress towards net zero, while we at the European Sustainable Food Coalition, on the other hand, really focus on enabling the food and beverage industry to make and to prove actual progress on this critical decarbonization journey. And as you outlined already earlier, we really tried to enable the industry here by a range of initiatives, like, for example, to create like a harmonized methodology for farm and product level impact assessment and communication. And this is precisely where the direct alignment with SBTi comes into the play. So we are on the one hand actively developing a methodology that empowers grocery retailers and food service companies to actually assess the impact of their food and beverage products, where we allow them to start with the data they have available today, so ingredients, the order of ingredients, nutritional values, really allowing them to get started with the data they have available, while at the same time fostering that transition towards gradually having more and more primary data that can be taken in. And the way how we approach that is that we have a conservative PCF methodology. Here we try to align as closely as possible for EUPEF, because here we apply prudent, conservative assumptions whenever there is no primary data available. So when we don't know, for example, what kind of packaging is being used, we would rather start with, higher assumptions, which then creates a very strong incentive for the players upstream in the value chain to invest into being able to provide more and more primary data over time and to really take action towards decarbonization, with obviously the long-term ambition to establish the PCF as an additional pivotal dimension on which producers really need to compete on. So ultimately, our vision is to ensure that producers understand that the PCF of a product is nothing else like the price or the quality. It's just a purchase criteria that retailers as well as consumers and other stakeholders are going into account in their decision-making progress. On the other hand, we are developing a reporting PCF methodology, which obviously utilizes industry average data whenever primary data is unavailable. And this is being engineered in a fully SBTi compliant way. And this obviously also encompasses SBTi flag guidance. So we have those two methodologies, and especially the reporting PCF. Here we have developing that in very close alignment with the SBTi standard. And we're very happy and grateful that SBTi invited us to also provide direct feedback on the upcoming guidance in this area, and we'll for sure make use of that. So ultimately, we are absolutely united in our shared aim. We want to rigorously support the food and beverage industry on this fundamental journey towards increasingly robust primary data-driven decarbonization. I think that's where we really want to support the industry on, and that's where we are also fully aligned on.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for pointing these important details of our work out and the synergies with SBTi. Very good points. Then, Michael, back to you. Can you share more about the real-world challenges food companies face in aligning with SBTi and what tools, support, or frameworks can make this process easier?
Yeah, I would rather say it's a challenge related to achieving effective absolute emission reductions and getting the building blocks for that right, rather than a challenge with respect to aligning to SBTi. I think the main challenge that we are facing, and it was mentioned before by you and others as well, is the dependency on a really effective and working collaboration throughout the upstream supply chain, in comparison to Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, where we can simply, with taking a little efforts and throwing some resources at some measures, we are able to achieve the goals more or less ourselves. In Scope 3, we are highly dependent on upstream players on the supply chain that is working together with us in order to reach our goals. So we require both on the level of transparency and also on the level of harmonization, harmonized tools, harmonized methodologies. We really need to come to a paradigm switch on how we are working together, how we measure emission for products, how we share data along and across the supply chain, that we all need data that is reliable, that we can use for steering our internal targets achievement, and also for valid reporting and informing our different stakeholders that we are having. In order to find these answers, answers to these questions, we need to work together, which is not always the easiest way to do in a pre-commercial environment, also in an environment which is particularly competitive. We need to get used to sharing more information, sharing more also our pathways, our understanding of where we are and where we would like to be in the future. So it's not the easiest thing that we can give ourselves as a task, but I think it's unavoidable in order to make progress in Scope 3. We got to work together, and this is why initiatives like the ESFC and common frameworks that we can work under, like SBTi, are so necessary for us. Not saying that everything is easy and everything is clear. I mentioned that before. Also, SBTi here and there refers to some standards, because not everything can be defined and should not be defined in detail by SBTi itself. But also these references to other standards may not always help on all sides, because not everything is clear and defined. The guidelines are sometimes lacking clear guidance that we would require. So you need to take a lot of effort and adapt also to this ever-changing environment which we are under. Maybe one fact which is making the lives of also people that have the task to communicate about what we are doing with respect to sustainability a little bit tricky is communicating about these targets. It's clear that the SBTi is having a scientific approach, and it should be like that. But that means also that the result of this is quite technical, detailed targets, and making everybody aware and understand what is a flag target, what is energy and industry. Starting with Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 is maybe not the easiest thing, because the various stakeholder groups that we need to inform, that we need to communicate about this, are having certainly different understanding. So this requires quite some effort and also creativity on how to communicate what we are actually trying to do and what is the main challenge that we have in front of us.
Yeah, I can only underline what you're saying here. Innovation, collaboration, and harmonization are essential and key to make progress, and also that these new challenges that we're facing require a change of the way we used to work, and making it essential to work together with competitors as well. Then I would like to continue with another question for Kim. Given the increasing pressure and considering the current reliance on category averages or main ingredient proxies, how urgently and by what specific timelines will SBTi require transition to more detailed product level emission data for food and beverage companies to obtain target validation and also alignment with climate science?
Yes, so as mentioned, we are revising our corporate net zero standard. Good to know is that this new standard will also replace the near-term requirements. So we'll have one standard for both near-term and net zero targets. And in that standard, we are now proposing a change to the data requirements. For larger companies, currently we are not requiring verification, but we're proposing to require verification of data for larger companies, and also are asking for a gradual improvement of data. So this requirement is still under development, and we're still asking feedback on it as well. But good to know that we are looking at requiring from companies to improve data, but this will not be implemented in the very near future. So we hope to finalize the standard in 2026, and it will be mandatory for use in 2027.
Thanks a lot for sharing these insights. And yes, improving data by step and starting with what's available right now is indeed very crucial. Then Markus, what do you think? How can farm and product level data support credible progress on corporate climate targets, and how does that link to the ESFC mission?
Yeah, this is a very critical question, and basically goes right to the heart of how companies in the food and beverage space can achieve credible climate targets. So for retailers and food service companies, as you've mentioned earlier already, more than 90% of their emissions typically sit within what's called Scope 3, meaning indirect emissions from the value chain. And a very large part of this really comes from the products that they are selling every day. And today, as you've also pointed out, many of these companies just calculate these emissions based either on category average emission factors, or they maybe take a look at the most important ingredients that are included in that product. But that basically means that a pasta sauce, regardless of whether it is meat heavy or cheese based or vegan, gets the same or similar emission factor. And that also ultimately means for the retailers that it becomes very, very difficult to demonstrate any tangible progress, because as a retailer or as a food service provider, even if your supplier replaces beef by plant-based alternative, even if they switch to more climate-friendly packaging, they source from a low deforestation region or take other steps, those improvements that are actually happen in the supply chain are not really reflected in your Scope 3 data. And that also means that you cannot incentivize any of these moves upstream. So it really becomes hard to incentivize change ultimately. And to really drive and demonstrate progress, retailers are now increasingly partnering with product level impact assessment providers. I think we have 6 or 7 of them being a member of the European Sustainable Food Coalition, such as also our company inoqo, to assess the impact of their tens of thousands of products. And this solution basically enables them to start assessing the impact of their thousands of products by taking ingredients, recipes, packaging material, country of farming of ingredients, and other data already into account in a very granular way, and then really allows the retailers and food and service providers to put very effective incentives in place that lead to their upstream partners wanting to make more and more primary data available, that we as an assessment technology can then take into account when assessing the products. But very important also to mention that a very large portion of these emissions really originates from the farm stage. So therefore, it's absolutely essential that we move beyond country representative average data for ingredients toward supply chain specific farm level data. And this is precisely, as you mentioned earlier already, what we are trying to support with the European Sustainable Food Coalition, where we're working on a comprehensive farm-level primary data sharing mechanism. So that's basically a framework that will allow an ingredient processor, for example, a dairy company, to work with one of our farm-level impact assessment members, organizations like Cool Farm Tool or Agrina or Klim or many others that are member of the ESFC already. And together they can track specific farm level activities that have an impact on the product carbon footprint of the ingredient, so of the milk. So for example, how much milk, how much fertilizer is being used to produce the feed of the cows, or manure management or electricity use. And through this mechanism that we are developing here as part of the European Sustainable Food Coalition, we envision to enable that farm level primary activity data or access rights to that farm level primary activity data to be sent down the supply chain without actually, the brand or retailers like Schwarz Group having access to the underlying data themselves. They receive an API endpoint, they receive a key, but the underlying data is only available for product impact solution providers, technology providers, consultants that have signed a strict NDA with the European Sustainable Food Coalition, and consequently get access to how much fertilizer has been used for producing that animal feed for the cows, or how much diesel has been used by the 400 farmers that produce that milk. And that enables organizations such as us to then ultimately replace the farm level or the country representative data by real supply chain specific data. And that's a real crucial step, because that's the only way how retailers and food service providers ultimately can make progress towards net zero, how they can really also incentivize their upstream players to move towards more climate friendly practices.
A lot of work that has to be done here, making it even more important to work on it already now and not wait until it's regulatory requirement. Then my last question, I would like to keep open who of you wants to answer it, as I believe all 3 of you for sure have interesting insights onto this topic. So the question is, how do we bridge the gap between corporate targets and consumer understanding? Can consumer-facing impact labeling support that connection? Who of you wants to go first?
So who wants first? Then I may start and break the ice on this question. I think we'll have to carefully think about how to inform and how to enable our consumers to get a better understanding of what is a sustainable product. If we take a look at the latest studies that were checking on the effectiveness of product labelings, we can see that, it is helpful for the ones that are already committed, for the ones that are already informed, but for the ones that do not much care about that or are lacking knowledge, for these, it's a little bit difficult. So the effectiveness, how this is actually accepted as a shopping guidance by the consumers, is really something we have to take carefully. We have to carefully take a look at, not to rely on this as the only means in order to inform the consumer. I think that's a very important point. Also, when we are informing the consumer, about what are we informing the consumer? Are we informing the consumer about a climate-friendly product, about a climate-neutral product, or is it about a sustainable product or sustainably produced product? So whereas we are certainly increasing complexity a lot when we're talking about sustainability as a whole, and not focusing only on one environmental impact like climate change. But if we're only informing about climate, how we are dealing with conflicting targets, because animal welfare and emission reduction is something that might be conflicting. So there's a lot of questions with respect to consumer information that we need to tackle, and that for which we need to find answers to. And as I mentioned before, I don't think it's a task that can only be done by putting a small logo or label on a product, but it's rather a societal challenge and a societal task than only something that needs to be done by companies that are throwing products on the market or putting that in their shelves like ourselves. So it's really something that different stakeholder groups need to take on, and this in enabling and educating the consumer is something that can also needs to be a combined effort by not only retail sector, not only food production, but various other societal stakeholders as well. Sorry, I took a lot of time now for my answer to this question.
But now the ice is definitely broken. So now I have to come in. I totally agree with you that impact labeling alone is just the tip of the iceberg, or can only be the tip of the iceberg. Where I really see huge opportunities that retailers leverage their consumer apps, leverage their digital engagement capabilities to really, ultimately take advantage of a huge business opportunity that's out there by really moving beyond just offering attractive products at an attractive price, as retailers are focusing on today, and by basically capitalizing on the fact that more and more consumers are interested in transitioning towards a healthier and more sustainable diet. And what we see that forward-looking retailers really see this as a huge chance for them, because retailers can basically go beyond simply collecting data, scope 3 data for reporting. Instead, they can really use this data to become their customer's partner in transitioning towards a healthier and more sustainable diet. And it's important to also talk about healthier in that context, because that's obviously a huge motivator. So what we really see is that they do not just by providing data around the environmental and health impact of the products, stop there, but also use content, can use nudging, gamification to really bring consumers along onto that journey towards a healthier and more sustainable diet. More and more retailers are already thinking like this shift towards planetary health diet. I think also Schwarz Group has, or Lidl at least, has some very good targets here. And this is not only vital for really cutting emissions, but it's also a great business opportunity for the retailers and food service sector, because this way retailers can address new target groups amongst consumers who care about that. They can increase their sales of fresh products, organic products, vegan products, which are typically high margin products. And they can really increase the money their consumers spend with them, so their share of wallet, by providing, for example, feedback and analytics, how healthy, how climate friendly the diet was over the course of the last month. And this is where it gets really interesting for the sustainability teams, because that's a huge opportunity to move from, just checking boxes and reporting to really driving substantial business value and unlocking substantial business value. But where I totally agree with you is that, labeling alone is just the tip of the iceberg. Much more interesting is really engaging with consumers through apps, where we also as a coalition obviously are all aligned that climate is just the beginning. We need to think of it more also from a biodiversity perspective, social perspective, animal welfare perspective, and look at the multidimensional impact of the food choices that we take. But overall, still a lot of work to do, but also a huge business opportunity for the whole industry.
Kim, do you have anything to add?
Well, actually, I think those were really great answers that I can only echo. And I don't have a lot to contribute, except for that I do think also governments have an important role to play in educating consumers on this topic and ensuring that they get credible information. And I think it would be great to use the rest of the time to answer some of the questions in the chat, maybe.
Yes, I totally agree. Thank you all very much for these interesting insights. A real pleasure to listen. And then let's see in the Q&A chat. I think you already have answered some questions, Kim. So maybe let's focus first on the questions that you haven't answered in written yet.
Yeah.
One would be, what would be limited traceability emissions?
Yes. So I think this question comes from me explaining that in our draft standard, we are proposing the concept of indirect mitigation, where it will be possible to count emissions reductions from indirect emission sources towards your reducing your target. And those are emissions for which you have indeed limited traceability. In the food sector, that would, for example, be a commodity from which you source from a supplier further down the chain, and you're not exactly sure which supplier it's coming from. And you would, for example, use a mass balance system or a book and claim system for this commodity. So that would be then a limited traceability. You know about where this, in case of mass balance, you know the supply shed of where this commodity is coming from, but you don't know the exact commodity, the exact supplier. But you could still count that as part of your supply chain.
Thank you. And then regarding the questions that you already responded to, maybe it still makes sense to point some of them out to the entire audience. Maybe not everyone is reading into it. So one would be, do you know whether the criteria SBTi for SMEs also will be changed to the omnibus criteria?
Yes, no. So in the new standard, we are proposing a new categorization of companies, but this categorization is mainly to support companies in low-income countries to be able to set targets. It doesn't for companies in Europe. Those requirements are not changing. The current definition of the current bridge or definition, the criteria between large corporation and SME.
That's good to know. Then another question was, while submitting the net zero plans to SBTi, why 1.5 degree is still considered when we already have breached this landmark? Shouldn't we not push forward it to 2 degrees?
So officially we didn't go over 1.5 degrees yet. It might be a temporary. It might be temporary that we are over the 1.5 degrees, and it will be we will only go over officially over a longer, when it happens over a longer time period. But even if we do, we should try to stay as close as possible to 1.5 degrees as we can, and therefore stick to the current 1.5 degrees pathway, even though we might then overshoot 1.5 a little bit. But it's crucial. The higher temperature gets, the more catastrophic the consequences will be. So we should all try to really limit emissions as much as possible in line with the current 1.5 degrees pathways.
I totally agree here. Anything to add from Michael or Markus on this question? I assume you're also aligned, but feel free.
Yeah, absolutely aligned. I mean, we shouldn't reduce the efforts just because we may overshoot. Actually, it's a good reason to strengthen the efforts.
Totally agree. And let's keep in mind that unfortunately not all companies out there will commit to SBTi. So there will be lots of companies out there that are nowhere near to achieving those targets. So those who are really, signing up need to even work harder.
Exactly. Then another question. In sectors with limited access to upstream data like food retail, how can companies bridge the gap until primary data becomes more available?
Sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead first.
I think that's the big question we try to answer today. And how can we deal with secondary data? And the answer is to start with what you have and try to improve your data and get more and more primary data step by step, and to already take action where you can as a company. If engage with your suppliers, try to ask them to reduce emissions and to provide you with data. I think that's a summary, but really step by step, and try to improve the areas where you can and as soon as you can.
I would like to stress that, if I may, it's nothing where we can just pull a switch and then decide on ourselves. Now, today, we are from now on, we are working with primary data and not using any statistical averages anymore that we are used to work with in emission factors and stuff like that. It's rather a process than a decision that we are taking on, because if we would now decide we would like to work with primary data only, where to get them, right? I mean, this data simply doesn't exist. I mean, more and more it starts to exist, and we are able to use it here and there, but not in the broader sense. And this is why, as Kim said, we need to work on that bit by bit, a product family for product family, supplier by supplier, and improve the picture as we go on. The goal must be to get more and more primary data into account, and not all at once, because it's simply not possible.
Yeah, and this is really where this conservative PCF methodology that we're working on as the ESFC, really plays such a crucial role, because it really allows the downstream players to start with the data they have available today, so the ingredients, order of ingredients, which allows solution providers to basically accurately assess the composition of products and to then assign emission factors on all ingredients and all processes that go into those products typically, while then having very clear incentives in place that lead to upstream players wanting to share more and more primary data with players such as us. And they can do that in a confidential way, right? They don't need to share their supply chain secrets with the retailer downstream. They can provide that to us in a confidential way. We can use it to replace the conservative assumption that we would apply onto that process or that ingredient in absence of primary data. And retailers, obviously, and that's very important, need to also provide clear incentives and use that conservative PCF to take listing decisions, right? To say, okay, now I have a third dimension, which is called PCF, which I can take into account in my listing decisions, or I can take it into account in my promotion decisions. The worst 20% of products in a certain category are not promoted anymore, or the top 20 products in a certain category get more marketing, get more exposure, so that I'm being able to sell more of these. So it's really giving the industry that tool that allows the retailers and the food service sector to ultimately use the PCF as a new competitive dimension that really pushes the whole industry to get active on collecting primary data and to start taking initiatives towards net zero.
All right, then looking at the time, I would say let's close the questions. If there's something important we couldn't follow up on, please feel free to reach out via email, and then we will get back to you. But yeah, on this point, a big thank you to our great speakers. It was really valuable insights that you shared. And for our audience, after the event, you will be redirected to our upcoming online event in June, where we have another set of high-tier speakers joining us from the European Commission, OECD, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development to discuss carbon footprinting in agri-food supply chains, as well as sustainability labeling in the EU food system. And in this context, we will hear more about the methodological fragmentation and research that has been done in this field, and obviously the strong need for alignment. Feel free to register and share with anyone who could benefit from gaining insights into these topics. And if you can't join live, you can still register to receive a high-level summary and the recording. Until then, I'd be more than happy to connect individually. You can see my contact info in the Q&A and on the slide here. So make sure to reach out if you want more information about our initiative, if any of your questions didn't get answered, or if you want to explore possibilities of involvement. Thank you all very much for attending today's event. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great afternoon, everybody.
Bye.